Greetings, students. Mr. Little here. And today on this History Bite, we're going to take a look at Chapter 18, Part 2, Africa and Networks of Trade. In this particular History Bite, you're going to be able to answer two essential questions. How are African states influenced by the expansion of trade networks, such as the Indian Ocean and Trans-Saharan trade networks during this time? And how do the political experiences of Western and Eastern Africa compare during this time period? So let's just get right into it. First, it's important to acknowledge that Africa has long traded within the continent. So for example, in ancient Egypt, there was a trade between Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt along the Nile. Kings in West Africa have long imported metal goods and animal skins from parts of Central Africa. And around the Great Lakes region, which is inland from East Africa, they have long imported a certain type of shell called cowrie shells from the coast, and it's been used as a local type of currency. So acknowledging inter-African trade is important. But we'll start with the Trans-Saharan trade networks in the West. Now, the Trans-Saharan trade during this time does, in fact, actually have an ancient precedent. The Romans did a lot of trade across the Saharan desert, so this is not unheard of before this time period, but it is new in this time period. Now, while most people cross the Sahara using horses and possibly donkeys, the introduction of camels from the Middle East and East Africa made this much, much easier. It takes about 70 days to cross the Sahara, and there's not a lot of water sources along the way. So camels, with their ability to store lots of water in their humps and eat basically anything, including the thistles and thorns that you find in the Sahara Desert, made this a real possibility. In addition to the development of a camel saddle, which made it possible to ride camels easier, as well as put things on camels' backs easier, meant that trade now across the Sahara would be a huge deal. Now, the camel was introduced earlier in history, but after the rise of Islam and the Caliphate, the camel really picked up its presence in the Trans-Saharan trade. Who was riding camels down to West Africa? Why? Islamic merchants seeking to do business, followed by scholars and missionaries who also sought to gain influence in West Africa. What did they trade? Well, they traded gold, salt, spices, in particular something called alligator pepper, and iron products, and of course, slaves for the domestic markets of the Middle East. Now, this trade connected West Africa with the growing region of Dar al-Islam. Now, of course, West Africa was never part of the Caliphate, but it did make West Africa a premier provider of gold. West Africa became synonymous with gold. Although it should be noted that the initial kingdoms that the Islamic people came in contact with, Ghana, did not actually control their source of gold. Future leaders would control the source of gold. But the desire for these rulers to promote trade and promote their connection with the Islamic world did sometimes lead to conflict, such as between the Songhai Empire and the Arab leaders in Morocco over sources of salt in the late 1400s. But this connection with the Islamic world also gave these West African leaders a sense of legitimacy, as can be seen in the unique brand of Islam in the Songhai Empire, which put the leaders of that empire in a very special place within their particular type of Islam. Now, if we go to East Africa, we also find a historic precedent for their trade with the Indian Ocean. Now, how does East Africa get roped into the Indian Ocean trade network? Well, just like Southeast Asia and parts of South Asia itself, the increasing demand for raw materials in other parts of the empire or in other parts of the ocean trade system lead to the creation of trade networks in these areas. Arab and Persian merchants were looking to East Africa for goods that they could sell, and they established a small trading post, and local African leaders later built these up into larger trading cities. This is how we get the Swahili city-states. Although it should be noted that African leaders built these cities. They were not built by Arabs or Persians, but Arabs and Persians did play a large part in the trade in East Africa. And of course, states wanted to be involved in this trade, as can be seen by Aksum, which was a state in East Africa that was cut off from this Indian Ocean trade, by hostile states on their coast, and this contributed in part to the collapse of that state around 1000 CE. Now, of course, these Swahili city-states, as they came to be known, a number of smaller states all along the coast of East Africa, played a major role in the eastern part of the Indian Ocean trade network for about 500 years. Their leaders of these city-states were happy to bring in merchants because they could tax them just like other states we've seen throughout this course. Now, of course, the leaders of this state adopted Islam as their official religion, but they did not force others to join. And most of the people in this part of Africa continued to keep their own religion, with only the leaders and the merchants and the elites adopting Islam in any meaningful, major way. Inland from the Swahili city-states to the south, you have a small kingdom called the Great Zimbabwe. And along with a number of other interior states, as in states that are not on the coast, the Great Zimbabwe took part in the Indian Ocean trade by providing the raw material that would be traded on the coast. So the slaves, the gold, the wood, and the salt that was traded on East African coast were provided by Great Zimbabwe. And this was one of their major roles in the Indian Ocean trade. But it should be noted that Great Zimbabwe was not influenced by Islam at all. And not until the 1700s would this part of East Africa become somewhat Islamicized. That would wait quite a bit of time. So you should be able to answer those two questions from the first slide, those two essential questions. And thank you for joining me on this bite of history, and I hope to see you next time.